Welcome, and we'll start off with our bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Thank you. And of course, we're in Parshat Re'eh, and hopefully you'll be able to see it in a moment. There we are. You should be able to see it now. And continuing from where we left off yesterday, where we'd been talking about the consumption of meat. And now we're on to somewhat of a different subject now. And again, the great concern that Moses has at this point is the whole idea of idolatry. And to just review for a second, even though idolatry and fetishism appear to be one of the same thing, in other words, worshiping objects, right? Objects. Nevertheless, the nature of idolatry is substituting something else for the divine, the sole divine creator of the entire universe. And that's substituting something else. And in terms of worshiping that whatever it is that you think is the source of your power and your salvation and your purpose and everything like that. So let's see how Moses puts it. Ki yachrit Hashem Elokecha et hagoyim. When, in this case, I believe ki means when the Lord your God cuts off those nations, asher atav vashama lereshedotam, where you are coming to inherit them, mipanecha, from before you, vayarashta otam, and you shall again inherit them, right? Lareshed means to inherit. You shall dispossess them, I guess we could say. V'yashavta ba'atzam, and you settle in their land. So let's keep going. Hishamer lecha. Be careful. Be careful. Guard yourselves. Pen tinakesh acharehem. And this word tinakesh, as you can see, I say here, see Rashi, because Rashi has a whole grammatical point to make regarding the translation of this word. So mokesh is a word that means trap. In other words, and this is in fact the way onkelos, and I'm anticipating Rashi a little bit, this is the way the Aramaic translation, in other words, lest you be entrapped after them. But there's also another root, nakash, which means to stumble or to beat against, or to clap against, right? So as opposed to be entrapped, they may be related, but they're not the same word. So after they are hishamdam, after they are destroyed, mipanecha, from before you, upen tidrosh, unless you search after, the word midrash, right? To search after, lest you search after lelohehem, after their gods, saying, and saying here means thinking, right? Echa ya'avdu hagoyim, how do those nations serve? How your goyim ha'ela means those nations, or these nations, et Elohehem. How do they serve their gods? Ve'eseken gam ani, and I will do the same. I will do the same. I'm impressed by their mode of worship. I want to understand it better, and I am going to do it myself. So, in other words, we're talking about going away from this worship of the divine worship that the Torah mandates us. Rashi now. So, pen tinakesh, lest you are whatever, right? So, onkelos tirgame. So, onkelos, in other words, the Aramaic translation here, it translates it lashon mokesh. He understands it as having the connotation of a trap. V'ani omer, but I say, Rashi's talking very seldom, as you know, does he speak for himself, but he says, but I say, shelo chash ledaktek balashon, that he wasn't really careful, that onkelos wasn't careful enough regarding the grammar of this sentence. Shelo matzinu nun belashon yokesh, okay, because we do not find the nun of the word yukash, okay, that is in this meaning of trapment, that there is never a nun, right, as the first letter. In other words, understanding the root of this word as being nakash, as opposed to yakash. So he says the word yakash, which has to do with the word meaning trap, okay, we never find a nun, and because here, if you look at it, right, it says, let's see, pen tinakesh. Do you see there's a nun there? And he's saying there's no way, if it meant to be the word trap from the root yakash, it would never have a nun there. So,
Rabbi, I
yeah,
have lure, to lure them.
to be lured by them.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
I mean, it's a little different than trap, and it has a little bit of a different
Well, a little
connotation,
bit, but if
but
you think
just as
about it,
smart. Yeah,
yeah, right. But essentially, a lure
it's the
and
same.
trap is the same thing, has the same purpose, has the
Mm-hmm.
same idea. Thank you, though. I appreciate
Okay.
it. Yeah,
It's
no,
always good to have a
it is very good. No, I appreciate that.
another PV.
Right. But the point is, it has nothing to do with luring or trapping or whatever, okay? And Rashi goes on to, "Va'afilu leyasod hanofel mimenu." Even there's a classification of verbs where the first letter of the verb is a nun, and sometimes the nun gets elided. And he says, even in the case of a root where the first letter is a nun, in other words, where it's nakash, we still don't find a situation where the nun disappears here. Aval belashon tiruf v'kishkush, but if it has the meaning of beating and striking, in other words, the verb now is nakash. Do you see that? As opposed to yakash. Matzinu nun. We find a nun in the conjugation of that verb, and he gives an example from the book of Daniel, chapter 5, and it says, this is Aramaic now, for arkavata and his knees, or arkavate, okay, da lada nakshan. You see the nun there, right? So one against the other. Da means one against the other. Nakshan, we're striking. In other words, his knees were striking each other, I suspect, in fear. V'af ze ani omer. And so in this case, Rashi says, I would also think, pen tinakesh acharehem, that in this case, this phrase, pen tinakesh acharehem, means, pen titaref acharehem. That it means, lest you, in other words, run after them, right? You try to join them, you try to go with them. Lihiyot karuch achar maasehem. In other words, to be folded after, and I'm using, of course, folded in a very broad sense, after their actions. In other words, to smack against, right? To smack against their actions, as opposed to be lured by their actions. So it may be a relatively subtle distinction, and in the final analysis, it means the same thing, but it's not. Rashi is saying, I want to be careful about how I'm translating these words, right? V'chein, and he says likewise in Psalm Tehillim Kuftet, Psalm 109, it says Yinakesh Noshe, right? Let the creditor, okay, the creditor beat lechol asher lo, right? Strike after everything that belongs to him. And it uses this verse Yinakesh, and it's saying what the psalm is doing is mekalel et harasha. It's cursing the wicked person, liyot alav noshim, that this person should have creditors, rabim, many creditors, vayu machzirim umenakshim, and they should go after, and they should beat achar mamano, strike after, want to acquire, right? Grab, something like that, right? Achar mamano, after his money. They should always be striking after his money. So this is, Rashi's being very careful about this word tinakesh, which of course is not a common word, but he's saying the grammatical formulation of this word has more of a meaning of striking after, somehow striking in one way or the other, and not so much about being lured. Right, so I suppose that the form is the idea of striking after or beating after on something, right, has more responsibility to it than if you're lured into something, right? There's a sense of a more conscious effort in deciding to go after something. And I think that's the point that Rashi's trying to make. Acharehi shamdam michpanecha. So it says, after they are destroyed from before you, achar shetireh she'ashmidem mipanecha. After you see how I, that is God, has destroyed them from before you. In other words, you're going into this land, you're seeing how God is helping you to destroy them. Yesh lecha latet lev. Right? You need to consider, to give heart. You need to consider mipnei ma nishmadu. On what account were they destroyed? Elu, these ones. Mipnei, but it's because maasim makulkalim shebidehem, on account of the corrupt deeds that they had. That literally means were in their hands. That they were engaged in corrupt deeds, afata lo ta'asechen. So you too shouldn't do it. In other words, you should be saying to yourself, if this was what God did to them, then that must be what's the reason God did it to them, and understand that it's because they followed corrupt ways, and I better not do that. I better not do that. It should be a warning. Kain shelo yavo'u acherim. So Moses is warning them, and he says, "V'lo ta'asechen, don't do the same kind of thing, so shelo yavu acharim, so that others don't come v'yashmiducha and destroy you." And of course, what does history show us? Sadly, right? The tragedy of humanity is its inability to learn from past mistakes, from experience. And of course, this all goes back in a way to the story of Cain and Abel, where God warns Cain about the consequences of following your heart and allowing your hatred to control your behavior. And need I say more? Echayavdu, this is asking yourself, how do they serve? Lefi shelo anash al avodah zara. So he says the reason why this is being mentioned here, in other words, that you're looking into how they serve, right? And he says, because up to now, it did not mention any punishment, anosh. It has not mentioned any punishment concerning idolatry. Ella, the only time when it said that this act is punishable, Ella is only regarding zivuach, in other words, offering up to it. The kitur would be offering incense. The nisuch would be offering libations. The hishtachava'ah, and bowing, prostrating before it. Kamosha katuv, as is stated. So the specific acts that have been forbidden are these specific acts that we just mentioned. Shekatuv, as it mentions, Shmot Kafbet, Exodus chapter 22, Bilti Lashem Levado. In other words, in other words, you should only do these particular things, right? Offering up sacrifices, incense, etc., to God alone, levado. Varim haneasim legavoha. In other words, the things that should be done to the one above, to the high one, meaning, of course, to God, you shouldn't do to anything else. So here, in this sentence, it comes and teaches you here, she'im darcha shel avodah zara, that if it is the practice regarding this particular idol worship, right, la'ovda b'vavar acher, to serve it in a different kind of way, in other words, other than the ones that were just mentioned, kagon, for example, and they give this example, po'er lipaor, in other words, we're saying defecating in front of Baal Peor, that this is the way it was worshipped. I know this is eyebrow raising the first time you hear this kind of thing, but people have funny ways of showing, of worshiping. So the way this particular idol was worshipped was that they would be defecating before it. V'zorek even the Marcolis. Marcolis is probably mercury, and apparently they would throw stones at. They had a pillar that was considered mercury, and the idol Mercury, and they would throw stones at it. In other words, even though these sound like disgusting and things that one would never associate with idol worship, right? Zohi avodato, that is the way they practice it. Whether it's the normal way one would think of it, but people have strange ideas at times. V'chayav alav, and you would be held guilty, liable for such activities. Zivuach v'kitur, so, right? V'chayav. Aval zivuach v'kitur v'nischut v'hashtachava'a, but with regard to offering up animals, right? Sacrifices, incense, libations, prostration, afilu shelo kedakachayav, even if that isn't the way in which that idol is worshipped, you would still be held liable for that idol if you worship the idol in that way, even if it is not the normal way. So we have reasons for mentioning the one set of the idol worship, or of worship, that says, regardless, worshiping an idol, whether it is normally worshipped that way or not, if you do that to the idol, that is punishable, because the only one you should do that to is the Lord on high. And with regards to how the idol itself is worshipped, even if it's in these bizarre kinds of ways, you're also liable. So, yes. There's a story that I remember being told about this this Jewish person who was giving I guess he was a carter or something, and he was taking an idolater from one place to another, and they passed a place of idol worship, and the idolater said, "Please stop the cart. I want to get out and worship the idol." So they stopped the cart. The idolater went in and worshiped the idol and came out. And at that point, the Jew said, "Well, you had a chance to worship him. I want to go in and worship him." And the Jew went in and peed in front of the idol. And when he stopped that, everyone said to him, "Wow, that is the most amazing way in which this idol has ever been worshipped." So you have to just the point of this is that you have to stay away as much as possible from this kind of behavior. So interesting and unusual sort of issues here. Okay. Lo tasechen, you shall not do this. Lashem Elokecha, before the Lord your God. Right? So obviously, if these are these bizarre practices, certainly you shouldn't do this, even if you think it's appropriate to do before God. Kichol ta'avat Hashem, right? Because every disgusting thing, right? Everything that would disgust God, asher saneh, which he hates, asu lelohehem, they did before their gods. So understanding the Rashi now, which is the traditional understanding of this, the context of these sentences now all of a sudden takes on a new form, perhaps a clearer form. In other words, the context now is saying that a person's looking to see how they worship their idols and saying to themselves, well, maybe I'll worship God in those particular ways to God, and that might be acceptable. And we're saying what was being said here is don't do that. That is not the way. It's right, because some of the ways in which they worship their gods are considered disgusting, right? So they did to their gods, ki gam et b'neihem ve'et benotehem. And he says, because even their sons and their daughters, yisrufu va'esh lelohehem, they would burn with fire before God, before their gods. In other words, that they would even sacrifice their own children. Now, this word gam means also, sounds, again, we'd call it technically pleonastic, meaning the sentence could easily be omit this word gam also. So the question becomes, what does also come to include? Why do we need this word also? Here we go, Rashi explaining this. Ki gam et penehem, for their sons or their children as well, because it says sons and daughters. So this is based on the Sifrei, and he says the word gam, lerabot et avotehem. This would include also their fathers, ve'amotehem, and their mothers. Amar Rabbi Akiva. So it wasn't just they either way. It isn't just limited to their sons and daughters, because apparently they also offered up. They would even offer up their parents. Rabbi Akiva, Amar Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva said, Ani ra'iti oved kochavim. I actually saw an idol worshiper, shekafto la'aviv lifnei kalbo, who tied up his father before his dog, the ochlo, and the dog ate his father. So this is pretty staggering kinds of stuff that we're reading today. But, one of the things, and we've said this, we've mentioned this before, is that we don't try to, pretty up life and the way life can be. That there's a sensitivity that says, look, if you're going to actually worship or practice a religion, you need to look at life as it really is and deal with it, and not have the sort of secret that you don't even discuss. So I think that's part of what's going on here, as even though it goes against our own our own sensibilities these days. But unfortunately, we know there's stuff that goes on that's pretty bad. All right, I'll go on. I don't see any hands raised, so we'll just keep going on here. Okay. New chapter. Et kol hadavar asher anochi metzaveh etchem. Every matter which I command you, oto tishmeru lasot, you should be careful to practice, right? You should guard yourselves to make sure you do it. Lo tosef alav, do not add to it. V'lo tigra mimenu, and don't take away from it. So this sentence is subject to more than one interpretation, but there's a traditional interpretation that understands this sentence in a specific way. So, et kol hadavar, right? So when it says every matter, again, the word kol, right? What do we mean by all or every? Kala kebachamura. So you need to be careful whether it is a light commandment or a heavy commandment or a serious commandment. We've talked about this. I think we discussed this yesterday. Tishmeru lasot. So again, this word tishmeru, you should be on guard to practice. And he says the purpose of this is liten lo ta'aseh al aseh. It's as if it's putting a negative commandment on a positive commandment. And that what I'm saying is that it's saying don't neglect to practice it. That's the negative commandment, because negative commandments are thou shalt not. So be sure to is a negative commandment in the sense of you shall not neglect to perform this commandment. So this is giving a negative commandment on top of a positive commandment. So if the positive commandment saying do this, the negative commandment saying do not neglect to do this. So ha'amurim pasha. So those positive commandments that are stated in this particular paragraph or chapter, shekol hishamer. Rashi tells us that any time the Torah uses this term hishamer, be on guard, lashon lo taseh, it has the connotation of be sure not to neglect. Lashon lo tasehu. It has the connotation of a negative commandment. Ella, however, she'ein lokin, one is not the punishment for transgressing a positive commandment when it is preceded by this negative commandment. There is no punishment of stripes. One of the punishments that a court had the ability to inflict was in fact beating, right? Stripes. And basically, the court would inflict stripes for the violation of a negative commandment. And I think the main point about this, the main takeaway, is how seriously these things should be taken, that the consequences are serious. And of course, nowadays, we tend not to take them that seriously. However, when it came to a positive commandment, even though it may be bolstered up by that negative commandment, the court does not inflict stripes for it. But they can inflict stripes for straightforward negative commandments, thou shalt not steal, something like that, if they wanted to inflict corporal punishment. Okay. She'ein lokin al hishamer, shall I say. So this, just finishing this up, one does not inflict stripes regarding a hishamer when there's this hishamer connected to a positive commandment. Lo tosef alav. This is very interesting and instructive. You shall not add. In other words, don't add to the commandments and don't diminish them. It's not talking about in general the whole scope of commandments, but it's specific, and he gives examples. Chamisha totafot bitfilin. So, for example, there are in the tefillin, right? There are like 4 little boxes, or that each contain a different paragraph in the head tefillin. There are 4 compartments. He says making 5 compartments. That's adding to a mitzvah. When the mitzvah says it should have 4 compartments, making 5 compartments. Chamesh, hay is also a number, right? It's a 5th letter. So 5 minim balalav, 5 different species in the lulav. That is, of course, the palm branch that we use on Sukkot. And there are 4 different species. There's the palm, there's the etrog, there's the willow, and the myrtle, and that's it, right? Again, aba'ah brachot, and adding another blessing, bebirkat kohanim, in the priestly benediction. There are 3 lines of blessing in the priestly benediction. Don't add a 4th. So you can see that it has to do with adding something more to a specific mitzvah in that particular context and that particular meaning. And with this, I am going to stop I'm going to stop the share and stop the recording.